They said it was impossible to land a plane at 18,000 feet on Mount Everest, but they never met two brothers who made a promise to their dying father that nothing could break, not even gravity, not even death, and definitely not a wheelchair. Because when our father took his last breath 5 years ago, he made us swear on everything we loved that we would take his ashes to the highest point on Earth, where he always dreamed of standing, but never got the chance, and my brother Marcus was supposed to climb it with me. We trained for 2 years. We had everything planned until that winter night when a drunk driver crossed the center line and changed everything. My name is David Chen. I am 32 years old. I am a high-altitude pilot, and this is the story of how I landed a plane on the most dangerous mountain in the world to keep a promise to my paralyzed brother and our father, who taught us that some promises are more important than fear, more important than logic, and definitely more important than what everyone says is possible. Because when Marcus woke up in that hospital bed and realized he would never walk again, the first thing he said to me was not about his legs or his future. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said, "We can still do it, right? We can still take Dad to the top." And I held his hand and said, "Yes, brother, we will find a way, even if I have to carry you there myself." 5 years ago, our father died of a heart attack at the base camp of Mount Everest, just 3 days into what was supposed to be his lifelong dream expedition. And the cruel irony was not lost on any of us that he spent 40 years dreaming of that mountain, training for it, saving for it, talking about it every single day of our childhood, and then his heart just stopped before he even got close to the summit. And Marcus and I were devastated, but we knew what we had to do, because 2 years before that trip, Dad sat us down one night after dinner and said, "Boys, if anything ever happens to me if I do not make it, I want you to promise me something. I want my ashes scattered at the highest point you can reach. I don't care how you do it. I don't care how long it takes. But promise me I will touch the top of the world, even if my body can't climb there." We promised him that night without hesitation, because that was who our father was. He was a dreamer who worked as an accountant to support his family. But every weekend he took us hiking, climbing, teaching us that the mountains were where you went to remember who you really were. And he told us stories about Everest, like other fathers told bedtime stories about dragons and knights. Except his stories were real stories about Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary, about the death zone, about winds that could freeze your lungs in seconds. And he spoke about that mountain with such reverence, such longing, that Marcus and I grew up believing that somehow, someday, we would stand on that summit as a family and bring Dad's dream full circle. After he died, Marcus and I spent 2 years preparing. We quit our jobs. We trained 6 days a week. We studied high-altitude physiology. We learned ice climbing, technical rope work, everything we needed to summit Everest, the traditional way, and we were ready. We had permits. We had gear. We had a team of experienced Sherpas who agreed to help us, and we had Dad's ashes in a small titanium container that Marcus carried in his backpack every single day to remind himself why we were doing this. And then 3 months before our departure date, Marcus was driving home from the gym on a Tuesday night when a drunk driver ran a red light going 70 miles per hour and hit him head-on. I got the call at 2 in the morning from a hospital I had never heard of in a part of the city I rarely visited. And when I arrived, the doctor took me aside and said, "Your brother is alive, but there is significant spinal damage. We don't know yet if he will ever walk again." And I remember standing there in that fluorescent hallway, smelling disinfectant and coffee and despair, and thinking that this could not be happening. Not now. Not when we were so close. And then I walked into Marcus's room and saw him lying there with tubes and monitors everywhere, his legs motionless under white sheets, and he looked at me with this expression that broke my heart, because it was not fear or sadness, it was guilt. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I am sorry, Dave. I ruined everything." But he had not ruined anything. The drunk driver had ruined everything. And over the next 6 months, while Marcus went through surgery after surgery and endless physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and discouraged, I watched my brother fight harder than I had ever seen anyone fight, but his legs would not cooperate. The doctors said the damage was too severe. He would need a wheelchair for the rest of his life, And I saw something die in Marcus's eyes when they told him that not hope for walking again, but hope for the mountain, hope for keeping our promise to Dad. Because how do you climb Everest when you cannot walk? How do you reach the highest point on Earth when you cannot even stand? One night about 8 months after the accident, I found Marcus in the garage at midnight, sitting in his wheelchair staring at the climbing gear we had bought together. Ice axes, crampons, harnesses, ropes, all carefully organized and unused. And he was holding Dad's ashes and crying silently. And I sat down next to him on the cold concrete floor, and we did not say anything for a long time. And then Marcus whispered, "Do you think he is disappointed in us? Do you think Dad is up there somewhere thinking, we failed him?" And I said, "No, Marcus, Dad was never disappointed in us. He was proud of us always." And Marcus said, "But we promised Dave. We promised we would take him to the top, and now I cannot even take myself to the bathroom without help." That was when the idea hit me like lightning, like something Dad himself had whispered in my ear. And I said, "Marcus, what if we do not climb? What if we fly?" And he looked at me like I had lost my mind and said, "What are you talking about?" And I explained that I had been researching high-altitude aviation, that there were pilots who had landed small aircraft on Everest before, not at the summit but close enough at base camps and high camps, and that maybe, just maybe, if I got my high-altitude certification, if I found the right plane, if I planned everything perfectly, I could land at 18,000 feet, maybe even higher, and carry him there, carry both of them, Dad's ashes and my brother, to the roof of the world. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, processing what I had just proposed, and then he started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but a disbelieving, desperate laugh. And he said, "Dave, that is insane. That is suicide. You cannot just land a plane on Everest. The air is too thin. The winds are too strong. The landing zones are the size of parking spaces. You will kill yourself." And I said maybe. But I would rather die trying to keep our promise than live knowing. I did not even try, and Marcus went quiet again. And then he grabbed my hand, squeezed it hard, and said, "If you are serious, if you really think you can do this, then I am with you all the way, because I would rather die on that mountain trying than live down here with this guilt forever." The next 3 years were the hardest of my life. I sold my car, sold most of my possessions, moved into a tiny apartment, and poured every dollar I had into getting my high-altitude pilot certification and buying a modified Pilatus PC-6 Porter, the only single-engine plane capable of landing above 18,000 feet, and even then it required extensive modifications, a turbocharged engine, reinforced landing gear, specialized instruments that could function in extreme cold and reduced oxygen. And I spent months working with engineers and high-altitude experts, designing a custom oxygen system that could keep Marcus and me alive long enough to complete our mission, because above 15,000 feet your body starts dying every minute without supplemental oxygen. Your brain swells, your lungs fill with fluid, your judgment deteriorates, and you have maybe 20 minutes before you become unconscious. I also had to learn to fly in conditions that would terrify most pilots, because the Himalayas are not like flying over Kansas or California. The weather changes in minutes. Winds can hit 200 miles per hour. The air is so thin that engines lose 70% of their power, and landing zones are surrounded by peaks that pierce through clouds like teeth, waiting to rip your wings off if you miscalculate by even 50 feet. And I crashed twice during training. Not actual crashes, but hard landings that damaged landing gear and cost me thousands in repairs. And each time I thought about quitting, each time I wondered if Marcus was right, if this was suicide. But then I would think about Dad, about his face, when he talked about Everest, about the promise we made, and I would get back in that plane and try again. Marcus spent those 3 years preparing too. He worked with physical therapists to build up his upper body strength, because even though I would fly him there, he still needed to be able to move himself in and out of the plane and survive the altitude and the cold. And he studied everything he could about high-altitude survival, about frostbite, about cerebral edema, about the 100 ways the mountain could kill us. And people thought we were crazy. Our mother begged us to give up our friends, said we had survivor's guilt, that we were trying to die to join Dad. But they did not understand that this was not about death. This was about life. About honoring the man who gave us life, about proving that promises matter even when keeping them seems impossible. We also had to deal with permits and permissions, because you cannot just fly into Nepal airspace and land on Everest without government approval. And that process took 2 years of paperwork, bribes, meetings with officials who thought we were insane, and finally we got conditional approval. Conditional meaning, if we crashed, if we died, if we caused an international incident, Nepal would deny they ever authorized it, but we did not care. We had our window. April 23rd, a date chosen, because weather patterns suggested it might offer a brief calm window in the otherwise deadly Everest jet stream, and we had exactly 4 hours to fly from Kathmandu, execute the landing, spend 10 minutes on the mountain, and return before the weather turned. The night before the flight, I could not sleep. I lay in my hotel room in Kathmandu, listening to prayer bells from nearby monasteries and thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Engine failure at altitude, sudden weather change, landing gear collapse, oxygen system failure, and the list went on. And Marcus was in the room next door, probably thinking the same thoughts, probably wondering if we were about to join Dad sooner than expected. And at 3 in the morning there was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, Marcus was there in his wheelchair holding Dad's ashes, and he said, "I needed to see you. I needed to make sure you know that if something goes wrong tomorrow, if we didn't make it, I want you to know this was worth it. Keeping this promise with you was worth everything." We hugged for a long time, my brother and I thought about how unfair life had been to him, how he lost his legs and his dreams and his future in one terrible moment. But somehow he still had hope, still had fight, still believed in impossible things. And I said, "Marcus, we are going to make it. I promise you tomorrow, we will stand on that mountain together, you and me and Dad, and we will prove that nothing can stop us. Not gravity, not fear, not wheelchairs, not death itself." And he smiled, that brave, broken smile, and said, "I believe you, brother. I have always believed in you." And then he went back to his room, and I stood there in the doorway, wondering if I had just lied to him, wondering if I was leading my brother to his death. At 5 a.m., our support team arrived, a Sherpa guide named Pemba, who had summited Everest 11 times and agreed to help us despite thinking we were insane, and a doctor named Sarah who specialized in high-altitude medicine and insisted on coming in case we survived long enough to need medical attention. And we loaded Marcus into the plane, carefully securing his wheelchair in a custom harness I had designed, and making sure his oxygen system was functioning properly, because if his oxygen failed at 18,000 feet, he would be unconscious in 3 minutes and dead in 10. And I did my final pre-flight check, knowing that there would be no second chances, no do-overs. If something went wrong up there, we were done. The flight from Kathmandu to Everest takes about 45 minutes in perfect conditions, but these were not perfect conditions. As soon as we cleared the valley, I hit turbulence that threw the plane sideways, and I heard Marcus gasp behind me, and I said, "Hold on, brother, this is just the warm-up." And he laughed, that nervous laugh people make when they are terrified but trying to be brave, and I focused on flying on, keeping the plane steady, on watching my instruments, because at this altitude, you cannot trust your senses. You cannot trust what you see or feel. You can only trust your instruments and your training, and hope that both are good enough. As we climbed higher, the air got thinner, and the engine started struggling. Even with the turbocharger, we were losing power fast, and I had to make a decision: push higher and risk engine failure, or stop short and not reach the landing zone I had identified. And I looked back at Marcus, and he nodded once, like he knew what I was thinking. And I pushed the throttle forward, and the engine screamed, and we climbed higher into air. So thin, it felt like flying through nothing, through space, through the edge of the world itself. And then I saw it, Everest, rising ahead of us, so massive, so impossible that it did not look real. It looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare. And I thought, this is it. This is where we keep our promise, or where we die trying. The landing zone I had identified was on the western CWM, a glacial valley at 18,000 feet that some climbers use as a high camp on their way to the summit, and from the air it looked ridiculously small, maybe 200 feet long and 50 feet wide, surrounded by crevasses and ice walls, and I would have exactly one chance to land, because if I overshot the zone or came in too fast, we would slide right off the edge into a 1,000-foot drop, and there would be no rescue, no second chance, just a very long fall. And Marcus knew this because he was a climber. He understood the terrain, and when I pointed out our landing zone through the windshield, he went completely silent, and I could hear his breathing rapid and shallow through the oxygen mask. I began my approach from the south, coming in low and slow, fighting crosswinds that tried to push me into the mountain face, and my instruments were going crazy alarms, beeping warnings flashing because we were so far outside normal operating parameters, and I ignored them all and focused on that tiny patch of ice ahead. And I heard Sarah praying in the back, and Pemba chanting something in Nepali, and Marcus saying nothing, just breathing. And I thought about Dad, about how he used to take us flying in a little Cessna when we were kids, and how he always said flying is just controlled falling. Dave, you point the nose where you want to go and trust that the air will catch you. 50 feet above the ice, I cut power almost completely, because at this altitude the air is so thin that planes want to float, they do not want to land, and I needed gravity to pull us down fast, and the plane dropped like a stone, and Marcus yelled, and I pulled back on the yoke at the last possible second, and the landing gear hit ice with a bone-jarring crunch, and we bounced once, twice. And I stood on the brakes, feeling them grab on the slick surface, and we slid forward 50 feet, 70 feet, and I thought we were going over the edge, and then we stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke. We just sat there at 18,000 feet on Mount Everest in a plane that should not have been able to land here. And I realized my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. And then Marcus started laughing, this wild, relieved laugh, and said, "We did it, Dave. Holy God, we actually did it." And Sarah was crying and Pemba was still chanting, and I just sat there feeling like I might throw up or pass out or both, because the altitude was hitting me hard now that the adrenaline was fading. But we did not have time to celebrate. We had maybe 15 minutes before we needed to take off again, before the oxygen started running low, before the cold penetrated our heated suits, before our bodies started shutting down from the altitude. So I opened the door and the cold hit me like a physical blow, negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill and the air so thin that even with supplemental oxygen I felt like I was suffocating, and I helped Marcus out of his seat and into his wheelchair, and Pemba and I carried him down onto the ice, onto the roof of the world, and Marcus looked around at the peaks surrounding us, Lhotse and Nuptse rising like frozen cathedrals, and Everest itself towering above us still 2 vertical miles higher, and he started crying. I pulled out Dad's ashes from my pack, the titanium container we had carried for 5 years through hospitals and rehabilitation centers and training sessions and broken dreams, and I handed it to Marcus and said, "You do it, brother. You are the one who never gave up. You are the one who kept believing." And Marcus held that container with both hands, and his whole body was shaking from cold and emotion and altitude. And he said, "Dad, I am sorry. It took so long. I am sorry I could not climb here like you wanted, but we made it. We kept our promise." And he opened the container and the wind caught the ashes immediately, and they swirled up into that impossibly blue sky and danced among the peaks and disappeared into the mountain. We stood there, the 4 of us at 18,000 feet, watching Dad's ashes become part of Everest, become part of the dream. He chased his whole life, and I put my arm around Marcus, and he leaned against me and said, "Thank you, Dave. Thank you for not giving up on me, for not letting my wheelchair be the end of our promise." And I said, "You never needed to thank me. Marcus, you are my brother. I would fly to the moon if that is what it took." And he laughed and said, "Maybe that should be our next project." And despite everything, despite the cold and the altitude and the danger, I laughed too, because that was so perfectly Marcus to already be thinking about the next impossible thing. We took photos, Pemba insisted on. It said that nobody would believe us otherwise, and we documented everything. The plane on the ice, Marcus in his wheelchair with Everest behind him, the GPS coordinates showing 18,200 feet, the highest altitude landing I ever made or probably ever will make. And then Sarah said, "We need to go. Now your oxygen levels are dropping." And I nodded. And we got Marcus back in the plane. And I did my pre-flight check with fingers so cold I could barely feel them, and I said a silent prayer to Dad, asking him to help us get off this mountain alive, because taking off at this altitude is even more dangerous than landing. The takeoff was terrifying. The air was so thin that we barely had enough lift, and we used every inch of that landing zone, and I had the throttle pushed to maximum, and the engine was screaming, and we were accelerating but not fast enough, and the edge of the ice shelf was coming, and Marcus shouted, "Dave," and I pulled back hard on the yoke, and the plane lifted maybe 5 feet off the ice, and then dropped again, and hit hard, and bounced. And this time, when we went airborne, we stayed airborne, barely clearing the ice wall at the end of the zone by maybe 10 feet. And then we were flying again, dropping down the valley, picking up speed as the air got thicker, and I heard everyone exhale at once. The flight back to Kathmandu was quiet. We were all exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, and Marcus fell asleep, still holding the empty titanium container. And I flew on autopilot, watching the Himalayas recede behind us, those impossible peaks that had taken so much from our family, but had also given us this one perfect moment of closure. And I thought about how Dad would have loved this, how he would have been so proud. Not just that we reached the mountain, but that we did it together, that we refused to let anything stop us. And I realized that we had not just kept a promise, we had proven something important, that love is stronger than gravity, that brotherhood is stronger than disability, that some dreams are worth dying for. We landed in Kathmandu to a crowd of journalists and officials who had heard about our flight and wanted to know if we were crazy or heroes. And I said we are neither. We are just two brothers who kept a promise to our father. And Marcus added from his wheelchair, and we proved that wheelchairs do not stop you from reaching the top of the world. They just change how you get there. And the crowd cheered and people took photos, and for a moment we were famous. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that empty titanium container. What mattered was that somewhere on the slopes of Mount Everest, our father's ashes were mixing with snow and ice and becoming part of the mountain he loved. 3 weeks later, I sold the plane. I could not afford to keep it anyway, and I used the money to start a foundation that helps disabled climbers and adventurers pursue their dreams, and we named it after Dad, the Robert Chen Foundation for Impossible Dreams, and Marcus runs it from his wheelchair. And every year we sponsor expeditions and adaptive equipment, and we tell our story to anyone who will listen, because we want people to know that impossible is just a word, that limits are just suggestions, that promises matter more than obstacles, and that sometimes the only way to honor the people we love is to do the things they could not do themselves. Marcus still has the titanium container. He keeps it on his desk at the foundation office. And sometimes I see him holding it, running his fingers over the engraving that says, Robert Chen, 1952-2019, the man who taught us to fly. And I know he is thinking the same thing. I am thinking that we did not just scatter ashes that day, we scattered hope. We scattered proof that love endures beyond death, beyond disability, beyond every reason to give up. And that is a legacy worth living for, worth flying for, worth risking everything for. Because in the end, the only promises that matter are the ones that seem impossible to keep, and those are exactly the ones worth keeping.